Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. Today we're going to be talking about Darwin's theory on evolution. Now in the previous lesson we discussed the many scientists before Darwin which influenced Darwin. Now let's actually look at how Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, which is widely accepted today. Now a brief history on Darwin. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, West England, and he always had this great interest in nature. His father actually saw no future for him as a naturalist and sent him to medical school. But Darwin didn't enjoy medical school, and he thought it was boring, so he ended up quitting to become a clergyman at Cambridge University. And he ended up becoming the protege of John Henslow, a botany professor. And after he graduated, he took a job from Captain Fitzroy on the HMS Beagle for a long voyage around the world. Now, Darwin's voyage, the HMS Beagle's mission at the time was to chart the unknown stretches of the South American coastline. And on this voyage is where Darwin really made his theory on evolution and got all these ideas. That's South America. So on that voyage, Darwin spent most of his time on the shore collecting plants and animals. And he described how different features of these organisms made them well suited to their environment. So he noticed how these organisms had different things, different traits, which made them suited for their environment. For example, let's say a fish has fins so that it can swim. So that would be an example of a feature which would make an organism suited for its environment. And he also spent a lot of time reading Lyell's Principles of Geology, and we talked about a lot about what Lyell did in the previous lesson, so if you don't know this scientist, go and watch the previous video. And after experiencing an earthquake, he observed that the rocks and fossils along the coast had been raised by several feet. Now, when the HMS Beagle came to an island known as the Galapagos Islands, this is really where Darwin got his idea on evolution when he noticed the finches. So the Galapagos Islands are a group of volcanic islands located near the equator. And he noticed, again, I just mentioned this, these several kinds of finches, and finches is they're a type of bird. And most of these Galapagos species were not known anywhere else in the world. So all the animals he saw on the Galapagos Islands were not seen anywhere else in the world, so it was really, really fascinating to Darwin. However, the animals on the Galapagos Islands were similar to the species that lived on the South American mainland. So these species that Darwin found on the Galapagos Islands had similarities to the species which were just a few hundred miles away near the coast. So Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos Islands had been colonized by organisms coming from South America. Now, this is where Darwin really made his first big conjecture on evolution, and that was this thing he called adaptation. Sorry, an adaptation is an inherited characteristic of an organism that helps it survive and reproduce in specific environments. So I just talked about that briefly with the fish, how a fish has fins in order to help it swim. That would be an example of an adaptation. Let me give you a few more examples here. Chameleons have the adaptation of camouflaging with their environment so that they don't get attacked by prey, by predators, and they don't become prey. So that would be an example of an adaptation. Snakes have fangs in their mouths, which helps quickly inject venom in their prey in order to kill it. That's another example of an adaptation. Bats have night hearing, and they can use echolocation to navigate in the dark when there's no light. That's another example of an adaptation. So basically, an adaptation is a characteristic which helps an organism survive in its environment and reproduce, so meaning create offspring. And an organism's body and body and behavior adapts to specific foods located on their homeland. That's another big part of adaptation. Adaptations is that typically these adaptations are going to be driven towards how an organism is going to get its food. Now, the really big idea that Darwin said was the mechanism of evolution. We talked about how Lamarck had two main things. He said use and disuse and the acquired traits, and that's how he said evolution worked. Now Darwin came up with this other idea on how evolution worked, and that is natural selection, and this is very, very important. So pay attention. Natural selection is a process in which individuals that have certain inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals because of those traits. Okay? So, for example, let's use this example with lizards. So let's say we have a huge population of lizards. Let's say 1,000 lizards, okay? And let's say 250 of them have this ability to climb tall trees to avoid floods, okay? They have this adaptation. And the other 750 don't. So eventually, with time, natural selection will occur, meaning that the lizards which are able to climb tall trees to avoid floods will not be killed by these floods, and the other 750 which don't have that adaptation are going to be killed. So with time, with natural selection, what's going to be left off are just these 250 lizards which can survive because they can climb tall trees, and all the other 750 lizards are going to be wiped out. So what happens is now you have this population of lizards which have the ability to climb trees, okay? And that population will reproduce and eventually create another set of, let's say, 1,000 lizards. And now all these lizards are going to have that ability to climb trees. So that's basically what natural selection is. It's where you have an individual with an inherited trait, and because they can survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals, the whole population itself is going to see this new trait form. And another way of looking at natural selection is survival of the fittest. So meaning that the organism which is most adapted for its environment is the one that's going to survive and reproduce, and the ones that are not are going to be the ones that don't survive. Now, Darwin's publications, this is how Darwin actually presented his work. By the 1840s, Darwin wrote out the major features of his hypothesis and set these ideas on paper. So he wrote about descent with modification and natural selection. And we talked about what descent with modification is in the previous video, so go check that out if you don't know what that means. And Darwin published it immediately before anyone else could come to the same conclusion and publish it first. You know, the scientific world is very competitive, so he wanted to publish this idea immediately. However, this other scientist came along. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and in 1858. And Darwin received a paper from Wallace, one of his colleagues, and Wallace had developed a paper on natural selection, which was similar to Darwin. So Wallace came up with the same idea on natural selection, just as Darwin did. Now, Wallace asked Darwin to evaluate his paper and also sent it to Lyell for publication. And in 1858, Lyell and a colleague presented both Wallace's paper and Darwin's unpublished essay to the Linnean Society of London. And that was a society that basically was responsible for taking these publications and storing them and actually giving scientists the credit they deserved for their ideas. Meanwhile, when this was happening, Darwin quickly finished his book, which he was making on natural selection, and he called it it was titled On the Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection, and he published it the next year in 1859. So although Wallace had submitted this essay first, Wallace thought that Darwin developed and explained the idea of natural selection much better than he did. So Wallace thought that Darwin should be credited for this theory, and so Darwin was given the credit for coming up with natural selection. Now, Darwin's book convinced most scientists at the time that life's diversity is a product of evolution. So because Darwin was so good at explaining natural selection, most scientists at the time, even though they were very conservative and thought about ideas like Aristotle and things like that, Darwin's book was able to convince them that natural selection was actually the way that evolution works, and evolution actually does exist. Now, in this book, there were three broad observations on nature. Okay, there's the unity of life, the diversity of life, and the relationship between organisms and their environment. And we're going to be going into depth with each of these three things. So, actually, in the first edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin never used the word evolution. But however, the last word in the book is evolved. But instead, he wrote about descent with modification, a phrase that showed his point of view of life. A brief review of what descent with modification is. That's basically as time progresses within a population, organisms get new traits. And you can see that in the previous video. I already mentioned that. And because many organisms had many sharing characteristics, he perceived a unity of life. So he thought that because, let's say, for example, all mammals are warm-blooded. That's an example of a trait that all mammals share. Because of this, he came up with this unity of life, meaning that all life came from one source. Okay, and he attributed the unity of life to descent. Like I said, to the descent of all organisms coming from a common ancestor. So everything coming from one single organism, and that's why all organisms tend to have similarities. And he reasoned that although all these organisms came from that common ancestor, descent with modification is really why we have the diversity. So again, if you look here, the unity of life is basically means that everything came from a common ancestor, and the diversity of life is basically the different traits from within different organisms is because of descent with modification. So just to get further into this origin of life idea here, Darwin viewed the history of life as a tree. So basically you have a common ancestor here, and then you see organisms and species branching off with different traits because of descent with modification. Kind of like a tree with multiple branchings coming from a common trunk out of the tips of the youngest twigs. Okay. And another big part of Darwin's book was, again, it was a very, very new idea. So Darwin had to really, really think on how he was going to convince the scientists at the time on how evolution works. So he actually talked about how artificial selection kind of can be related to natural selection. So he first discussed selective breeding and how that creates domesticated plants and animals. Well, what artificial selection is basically where humans will actually breed different organisms in order to get traits that they want. So let's say that a farmer went out and he made 1,000 corn stalks, and 50 of them had this unique ability to not need as much water as the other 950 around them. So the farmer will take those 50 corn stalks and breed them with each other so that he can have more corn which doesn't need as much water. So that's artificial selection. So Darwin, and at the time that was being practiced, so Darwin was saying, just like how humans use artificial selection in order to create domesticated plants and animals, nature itself also uses a similar process, natural selection, and that's how species evolve. And that really helps convince some scientists that yes, natural selection is the way how evolution works. Now, here, these are the main observations and inferences which Darwin. This is kind of describes how Darwin's way of thinking and how he actually came up with the idea of natural selection. There's two really big observations that Darwin noticed. The first observation is that the members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. So, within a population, you're going to see a widespread of different traits, even though you have the same organism. Okay. And the second big observation was that all species can produce more offspring than their environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. So if you can look at this in any population, and this is starting to happen to humans too in overpopulated areas, where even though the environment can support a specific number of organisms, species tend to overproduce, over reproduce, and go over that limit, and then some offspring fail to survive and reproduce, and they get wiped out. So from these two observations, he made two big inferences. The first inference is that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. So basically what that's saying is organisms which have better traits which are suited for their environment, organisms which are more fitted for their environment, are going to have a higher tendency to leave more offspring than individuals that are not suited for the environment. And this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to accumulation of favorable traits in the population in genetics, meaning that because the organisms which have traits more suited to the environment are going to reproduce faster than the individuals which are not suited for the environment, eventually with time the population will gain these favorable traits. And that is essentially just natural selection. Now, this observation here, all species can reproduce more offspring than their environment, that came from, this is one of Darwin's influences. We didn't include this in the previous PowerPoint because we thought it would be better here. It was Thomas Malthus, and he wrote about human suffering, disease, famine, and war. And he believed that human suffering resulted from the human population's potential to increase faster than food supplies and other resources. And from there, Darwin realized the ability to over-reproduce was a characteristic of all species, not just humans. And heritable traits are traits that can be passed down to offspring. So this is basically how this second inference came about. So these traits, a heritable trait is a trait which can be passed down to an offspring, I just said that. And an organism's heritable traits not only affects its own performance, but it can also affect how well its offspring copes with environmental challenges. So basically, when you see that how individuals with traits which are more suited for environment, these organisms are giving it to their offspring, those traits are called heritable traits. Okay, pretty simple. And how fast does this change occur? Darwin believed that if artificial selection can create a dramatic change in such a short period of time, then natural selection can cause change over hundreds of generations. So natural selection does take a long time, but it does actually exist. Okay. So let's a quick recap here. Natural selection, again, is a process in which individuals with certain heritable traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates because of those traits. Okay, and if an environment changes, or if an organism moves to a new environment, natural selection can result in adaptations to those new changes, giving a rise to new species. So basically, what that means is if an environment changes and or the organisms migrate to a different environment, these environments are going to have different traits. Therefore, since there's different traits, these environments are going to have different characteristics, meaning that it's going to select different traits, okay? And because of that, this can lead to different species being formed, okay? And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more. That's called speciation, so stay tuned for that video. And another point, even though natural selection occurs through interactions between organisms and their environment, it is not the individuals that are involved. This is not like how Linnaeus said, like a giraffe getting a big neck and then passing it on to its offspring. That's not how individuals evolve, but it's the population that evolves. Okay, so the individuals don't change, but the population changes with time. That's a very important point to know. And favorite traits can vary from place to place over time. So that means that like the traits that a environment is going to want changes depending on the location you're talking about, because obviously environments are different from each other. The environment in Europe is going to be very different from the environment in South America. So that's basically it for natural selection. I hope you stay tuned to see what else we have to say about evolution. But for now, natural selection and Darwin's views on evolution are as simple as that.